I had imagined the moment so many times. I imagined walking into our house after the deal closed and placing the signed agreement on the table. I imagined watching her eyes widen when she saw the number. I imagined telling her that all those years of sacrifice had finally paid off. I wanted to take her somewhere beautiful. I wanted to buy the house she had always dreamed about. I wanted to give her the life I had promised when we were younger and had almost nothing. But by the time the deal was nearing completion, our relationship had changed so much that I wasn't sure whether the surprise would still mean what I wanted it to mean. Then came the day everything became official. That afternoon, I sat inside a private boardroom with my attorney, my chief financial officer, and representatives from Northstar Holdings. The final documents were placed in front of me. My hands were surprisingly steady as I picked up the pen. I signed. One by one, the other executives signed their names. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then my attorney smiled and extended his hand. "Congratulations, Daniel. It's official." I shook his hand. The deal was worth $700 million. I looked at the document again, almost unable to believe it. 7 years of failure, sacrifice, sleepless nights, and doubt had led to that exact moment. My phone started buzzing with messages from my executive team. Everyone was celebrating, but I wasn't thinking about them. I was thinking about Vanessa. I decided I would take her to dinner that evening and tell her everything privately. I wanted the moment to be special. At 7:30, we arrived at an expensive downtown restaurant. Vanessa looked stunning. She wore an elegant black dress and expensive jewelry. I had come directly from the meeting, still wearing the navy suit I had worn when I signed the contract. She had invited 3 couples from her social circle. I knew most of them, but they barely acknowledged me when we arrived. Vanessa seemed much more interested in impressing them than talking to me. We sat around a large table, ordered drinks, and began talking. One of Vanessa's friends, Melissa, eventually turned toward me. "So, Daniel, how's the business going?" I smiled. "It's going well." Before I could say anything else, Vanessa laughed. "Oh, it's going." Everyone smiled politely. Vanessa took a sip of her wine. "Daniel is always working on something." One of the men at the table asked, "Are you still looking for investors?" I opened my mouth to answer. Vanessa beat me to it. "Please don't get him started," she said, laughing. "He'll talk about his little startup all night." The word little immediately caught my attention. I looked at her. She didn't seem to realize how insulting it sounded. I tried to ignore it. Dinner continued. They talked about vacations, expensive cars, real estate, investments, and private clubs. Whenever someone asked me a question, Vanessa often answered before I could. Then one of the men mentioned an expensive bottle of wine. The waiter brought the menu. Vanessa looked at me. "Daniel, are you paying for this?" I smiled calmly. "I can." She laughed. "That's the problem." The table became quiet. She leaned back in her chair. "You always say you can." I looked at her. She continued. "Maybe if you spent less time pretending you're some big businessman and more time actually making money, we'd be somewhere." Nobody laughed this time. I felt everyone's eyes on me. I could have told them the truth. I could have reached into my pocket, opened my phone, and shown Vanessa the confirmation sitting in my email. I could have told everyone at that table that only a few hours earlier, I had signed a $700 million deal. But I didn't. I simply picked up my glass of water. Vanessa shook her head. "See, this is exactly what I mean. You never say anything." I looked at her quietly. She didn't know that the man she was humiliating had just signed the biggest contract of his life. She didn't know that the company she called a little startup was now worth hundreds of millions. And she definitely didn't know that by the end of that evening, I would make a decision that would change our marriage forever. Because sometimes the most powerful response isn't an argument. Sometimes it's silence. And that night, I had never been more silent in my life. The silence at the table lasted only a few seconds, but to me it felt like an eternity. Vanessa looked around as if she had just made a clever joke, waiting for someone to laugh. Nobody did. Melissa lowered her eyes toward her plate, and one of the men suddenly became very interested in his phone. I could feel the embarrassment in the room, but surprisingly, I wasn't embarrassed for myself. I was embarrassed for Vanessa. The woman sitting beside me was my wife, the person who had once believed in me when I had nothing, and she had just reduced everything I had worked for to a joke in front of people she barely knew. I reached for my water and took a slow sip. Vanessa noticed my silence and seemed irritated by it. "See," she said, "this is exactly what I mean. You never react. You just sit there like you're above everyone." I looked at her calmly. "I'm not trying to embarrass you." She laughed under her breath. "Daniel, you already do." That sentence hit differently. It wasn't a joke anymore. It was something she genuinely believed. For years, I had told myself that Vanessa was simply frustrated because our success hadn't arrived as quickly as she wanted. But sitting there, listening to her speak about me like I was an inconvenience, I realized something much more painful. She didn't just think I was struggling. She had stopped respecting me. The waiter came over and asked whether we were ready for the check. Before I could answer, Vanessa smiled and said, "Yes, bring it over." The waiter placed the leather folder on the table. Vanessa immediately pushed it toward me. "You can handle this, right?" she asked. I looked at her for a moment. I knew exactly what she was doing. She wanted to prove something in front of everyone. Maybe she wanted them to see that although I wasn't successful, I could at least pay for dinner. I picked up the folder, opened it, and looked at the total. It was expensive, but after what I had signed that afternoon, the amount barely registered in my mind. I placed my card inside the folder without saying a word. Vanessa leaned toward Melissa. "At least he can still do that." Melissa gave her an uncomfortable smile. I pretended not to hear it. My phone vibrated inside my jacket. I ignored it. A few seconds later, it vibrated again. Then again. I knew exactly what those notifications were. My attorney had probably sent the final confirmation. My chief financial officer was probably celebrating with the rest of the executive team. Somewhere inside my phone was the official confirmation that Northstar Holdings had completed the first stage of the $700 million transaction. But I didn't want to look at it in front of Vanessa. I didn't want to turn that dinner into a scene. Eventually, everyone began standing up. Vanessa hugged Melissa and said they needed to do this again soon. I stood quietly near the entrance. The valet brought the car around, and Vanessa walked toward it without looking back at me. I followed. Once we were inside, the doors closed, and for a few moments neither of us spoke. The restaurant disappeared behind us as the car moved through the city streets. I looked through the window at the lights outside, trying to understand how the woman I had loved for so many years had become someone I barely recognized. After several minutes, Vanessa finally spoke. "You barely talked tonight." I kept looking outside. I didn't have much to say. She sighed. "That's exactly the problem." I turned toward her. "What problem?" She looked at me with frustration. "You don't understand what it's like being married to someone who is always chasing something that never seems to happen." I said nothing. She continued, "Every year it's the same story. Your company is growing. Your next deal will change everything. Your next investor will fix things. Your next idea will finally make you successful. I'm tired of waiting." I stared at her. "You think nothing has happened?" She shook her head. "What has happened, Daniel? We still don't live the life I thought we'd have." I almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. She had no idea what had happened that afternoon. She had no idea that the life she was complaining about was about to change beyond anything she had imagined. But I still didn't tell her. "Maybe you should ask me what's actually happening before you decide I failed," I said quietly. Vanessa rolled her eyes. "I've heard enough promises." Promises. That word stayed in my head. I remembered every promise I had made to her. The promise that I would build something. The promise that I would give her a better life. The promise that all the sacrifices would eventually mean something. And suddenly, I wondered whether I had spent so many years trying to fulfill those promises that I had forgotten to ask whether Vanessa still wanted the same things I did. When we reached home, she walked inside without waiting for me. She went upstairs, changed clothes, and disappeared into the bedroom. I remained downstairs. The house was completely quiet. I walked into my office and closed the door behind me. On my desk sat an old photograph from the early years of our marriage. Vanessa and I were standing outside our first apartment. We were young, broke, and smiling like we had everything in the world. I picked up the photograph and stared at it. I remembered that apartment perfectly. The paint was peeling near the windows. The kitchen was so small that two people couldn't stand in it comfortably. Our couch was secondhand. Our television had a cracked corner. But we were happy. Vanessa used to sit beside me while I worked late at night. Sometimes she'd bring me coffee and wrap a blanket around my shoulders when I fell asleep at the desk. She used to tell me, "One day you're going to look back at this and laugh." I wondered when she had stopped believing that. My phone vibrated again. This time I took it out. There were 12 notifications. The first message was from my attorney. "Congratulations, Daniel. The transaction is officially executed." The second was from my chief financial officer. "It's done. Northstar has confirmed the first transfer. We actually did it." I stared at the screen. $700 million. I should have felt unstoppable. Instead, I felt strangely empty. Then my attorney called. I answered. "Daniel, I know it's late, but I wanted to make sure you saw the confirmation." "I did. There's something else?" "What?" "The board wants you to remain CEO after the acquisition." I leaned back in my chair. "Okay. They're also restructuring your personal equity position." I frowned. "What does that mean?" He hesitated before answering. "Your remaining equity and compensation package will make your personal net worth approximately $240 million once everything closes." I closed my eyes for a moment. $240 million. A year earlier, that number would have sounded impossible. Tonight, it barely mattered, because all I could hear was Vanessa's voice. "You're embarrassing me." I looked at the old photograph again. My attorney continued talking, but I barely heard him. Finally, I said, "I'll deal with everything tomorrow." He asked, "Are you okay?" I looked at the photograph. "No," I said honestly. "I don't think I am." After hanging up, I stayed in the office for another hour. I didn't tell Vanessa. I didn't go upstairs. I didn't celebrate. I simply sat there thinking about the strange irony of my life. I had spent 7 years trying to become successful because I thought success would solve everything. I thought money would make Vanessa proud. I thought a big house would make her happy. I thought proving myself would make all the difficult years worth it. But now I had achieved the thing I had been chasing, and I felt more alone than I had ever felt before. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. Vanessa was still asleep when I quietly got dressed. I made coffee and stood in the kitchen looking at the 2 cups sitting beside the coffee machine. For years, making her coffee had been automatic. That morning, I hesitated. Then I made both cups anyway. I left hers on the counter and drove to the office. When I walked through the glass doors, my assistant immediately stood up. "Congratulations, Mr. Carter." I smiled faintly. "Thank you." She looked excited. "Everyone's waiting upstairs. The entire executive team wants to celebrate." I nodded. Before I could walk away, she said, "Your wife called twice." I stopped. "Vanessa?" "Yes. She said she needed to speak with you urgently." I looked at my phone. There were 2 missed calls from her. I didn't call back immediately. Instead, I walked into the conference room where my executives were waiting. The room erupted in applause. Someone had brought champagne. Someone else had ordered breakfast. The mood was completely different from the night before. People were hugging each other. Years of hard work had finally paid off. I smiled and shook hands, but part of me was somewhere else. Then my CFO approached me. "You okay?" I nodded. "Just tired." He studied my face. "You should be celebrating." "I know. You just signed a $700 million deal." I looked around the room. "I know." He smiled. "Then why don't you look happy?" I didn't answer, because the truth was simple. Money had finally arrived, but the person I had wanted to celebrate it with was the person who had made me feel worthless the night before. And I was beginning to realize that the biggest problem in my life wasn't whether I could become successful. It was whether my marriage could survive the moment I finally did. The next morning, I walked into my office knowing that my life had changed financially, but I wasn't sure what had changed emotionally. Everyone around me was celebrating the $700 million acquisition. Employees were shaking my hand. Executives were congratulating me, and my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Investors who had ignored my calls for years suddenly wanted meetings. Journalists were asking for interviews. Business partners who once told me my company was too small were suddenly sending congratulations. From the outside, it looked like I had finally won, but inside I felt strangely disconnected from all of it. The only thing I could think about was Vanessa's face at dinner. She had looked at me as if I were a man who had failed at life. She had no idea that the very thing she had been waiting for had already happened. I decided not to tell her immediately. It wasn't revenge. At least, I told myself it wasn't. I simply needed time to understand what had happened between us. For years, I had believed Vanessa's frustration came from insecurity. Maybe she wanted a nicer house. Maybe she wanted more financial stability. Maybe she was tired of waiting. Those things were understandable. But humiliating me in front of her friends was different. There was a line between frustration and disrespect, and she had crossed it. Around 10 that morning, Vanessa called again. I watched her name appear on my screen for several seconds before answering. "Hello." There was silence on the other end. Then she said, "Are you still angry?" I looked out through the glass wall of my office. "I'm not angry. You sound angry." "I'm thinking." She sighed. "About last night?" "Yes." She paused. I didn't mean everything I said. I almost smiled. "Which part didn't you mean?" She didn't answer. That silence told me more than words could have. Finally, she said, "Daniel." I was embarrassed. I closed my eyes. "You were embarrassed by me?" "Yes." She said it quietly, but she said it. "Why?" I asked. "Because everyone there is doing better than us." I looked down at the signed acquisition documents sitting on my desk. "Are you sure about that?" She didn't understand what I meant. "What?" "Nothing." I ended the call shortly afterward. That afternoon, something happened that changed the direction of our marriage even more. My financial advisor contacted me about our joint accounts. He said there were several transactions that needed clarification. I initially assumed it was a routine matter, but when he sent me the records, I realized they weren't routine at all. Over the previous several months, money had been transferred from one of our joint accounts into another account that I didn't recognize. I stared at the amounts on the screen. The total was more than $300,000. I immediately called him. "Who authorized these transfers?" I asked. He hesitated. "According to the records, they were authorized by your wife." I felt something cold move through me. "Are you certain?" "Yes." "Where did the money go?" "That's what we're trying to determine." He sent me the account information. The receiving account was registered under a financial company I had never heard of. I searched the name and found almost nothing. I called my attorney and asked him to investigate it discreetly. I didn't want to accuse Vanessa of anything without knowing the truth. 2 days later, my attorney called me back. His voice sounded unusually serious. "Daniel, we found something." "What?" "The account is connected to a man named Ethan Parker." I immediately recognized the name. Ethan had been one of Vanessa's friends from college. I had met him once years earlier. He was charming, confident, and extremely comfortable talking about money. I had never liked him, but I had never had a reason to distrust him either. "What does Ethan have to do with the account?" I asked. My attorney explained that Ethan had been involved in an investment company that had recently collapsed. He had significant debts and had been trying to raise money privately. The transfers from our joint account appeared to be going directly toward those debts. I felt betrayed, not because of the money itself. $300,000 was significant, but after the acquisition, it wasn't the thing that bothered me most. What hurt was the secrecy. Vanessa had taken money from our shared account and given it to another man without telling me. I couldn't understand why. I asked my attorney to keep investigating, and later that afternoon he sent me several documents. Among them was an email that immediately caught my attention. The subject line read, "Daniel can't know yet." I stared at those words for several seconds before opening it. The email was from Vanessa. It said, "I promised him I would help. Once Daniel's business finally becomes profitable, I'll have access to more money. Just give me time." I read it once, then again, then a third time. My heart sank. Vanessa had apparently been planning her financial future around the belief that my company would eventually become successful enough to give her the security she wanted. She had been giving money to Ethan while assuming I would eventually make enough money to cover everything. I couldn't understand how someone who had once believed in my dream could now be treating my success like a financial safety net. That evening, Vanessa came home around 8. She looked tired. She dropped her handbag on the counter and began removing her earrings. I watched her from the living room. "Where were you?" She looked at me. "Out." "With who?" She hesitated. "Melissa." I nodded. "Are you still in contact with Ethan Parker?" Her face changed instantly. only for a second, but I saw it. Why are you asking about him? Just answer the question. She looked away. Yes. Why? He's an old friend. Are you giving him money? She froze. Then she looked at me. Where did you hear that? That isn't an answer. She crossed her arms. You went through my accounts? We share those accounts. That doesn't give you the right to interrogate me. I found over $300,000 transferred to an account connected to him. Her expression became defensive. You don't understand. Then explain it. I was helping him. $300,000? He needed it. For what? She didn't answer. Vanessa, what is really happening? She looked away. I was trying to protect myself. From what? From you failing. The words were so unexpected that I almost laughed. From me failing? She nodded. I didn't know if your company would ever succeed. I needed security. I stared at her. So you took money from our marriage and gave it to another man because you thought I would fail? I didn't steal anything. You hid it. I was scared. You were scared? Yes. I stood up. You humiliated me at dinner because you thought I wasn't successful enough. Now I'm finding out you've been secretly moving our money because you thought I would never become successful. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. You don't understand what it was like. What was it like, Vanessa? Watching everyone else move forward while we stayed in the same place. We weren't in the same place. To you, maybe? I shook my head. You never asked me what was happening. You never told me. I was trying to surprise you. She stared at me. What do you mean? I walked toward my desk and picked up my phone. For a moment, I considered telling her everything. Then I realized she still didn't know. I opened the acquisition confirmation. I placed the phone on the table between us. She looked at the screen. At first, she didn't understand. Then her eyes widened. What is this? The acquisition. She looked at me. What acquisition? The one I signed yesterday. Her face became pale. I watched her read the number. Then she whispered, 700 million? I nodded. She looked back at me. You're serious? Yes. For several seconds, she couldn't speak. The woman who had called my company a little startup was now staring at proof that the company was worth hundreds of millions. But I didn't feel victorious. I didn't smile. I didn't say, I told you so. I simply looked at her and said, this is why I didn't tell you at dinner. Tears rolled down her cheeks. I didn't know. No. She lowered her head. You really did it. I did. She sat down slowly. Then she whispered, why didn't you tell me? I looked at her. Because I wanted to tell you when we were alone. I wanted to celebrate with my wife. She covered her face with both hands. And for the first time, I saw something in her expression that I hadn't seen in a long time. Regret. But regret wasn't enough to repair what had already been broken. Because now I had another question. If Vanessa had only loved the successful version of me, then what had she actually loved all those years when I had nothing? And I was about to find out. Vanessa stared at my phone as if the number on the screen couldn't possibly be real. Her eyes moved from the acquisition document to my face, then back to the screen. 700 million, she whispered. I nodded. She slowly sat down, almost as if her legs had stopped supporting her. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. I had imagined this moment so many times. I had imagined her screaming with excitement, hugging me, crying, telling me she always knew I could do it. Instead, there was only silence. Finally, she looked up at me and asked, why didn't you tell me? I looked at her for a long moment before answering. Because I wanted to tell my wife at dinner. I wanted to celebrate with you. Her eyes filled with tears. And then I humiliated you. I didn't answer. She already knew. I didn't know, she whispered. No, I said quietly. You didn't. She wiped her tears. Daniel, I swear I didn't know. I nodded. That's exactly the problem. She looked confused. What do you mean? I sat across from her. You didn't know whether I was successful. You didn't know what was happening inside my company. You didn't know what I was negotiating. But you still decided I was a failure. She lowered her eyes. I was angry. You were embarrassed by me. She shook her head. I was embarrassed by our situation. That's not much better. She looked at me, tears running down her cheeks. I thought we'd have more by now. I leaned back in my chair. We did have more. You just stopped seeing it. I reminded her of our first apartment, the cheap furniture, the late-night meals. The days when we had to calculate every dollar before buying groceries. I reminded her that we had once been happy without any of the things she now believed defined success. You used to sit beside me while I worked until 2 in the morning, I said. You used to tell me that none of it mattered as long as we were together. Vanessa covered her face. I remember. Then somewhere along the way, you started measuring our marriage by what other people had. She looked at me. I know. And you started measuring me the same way. She didn't defend herself anymore. That was different. Usually, Vanessa would become angry or change the subject whenever we had difficult conversations. This time, she simply listened. After a long silence, she said, I was jealous. I looked at her. Of who? Everyone. She laughed bitterly through her tears. My friends, their houses, their vacations, their husbands, their lives. I kept looking at them and thinking we were falling behind. I asked, and what did you think would happen if my company failed? She answered honestly. I thought I'd be trapped. The word stayed between us. Trapped. Trapped with me? I asked. She immediately shook her head. No. Trapped in a life I didn't want. I nodded slowly. At least you're finally being honest. Then she looked at me and said something that surprised me. I thought you would never become successful. I stared at her. I know. I was wrong. I nodded. Yes. She looked at the acquisition documents again. And now you're worth more money than we ever imagined. The company is worth more. My personal position is complicated. But you're rich. I looked at her. That's not the point. I know. She lowered her head. I know it isn't. The next morning I met with my attorney. We discussed the acquisition, the restructuring, and the financial arrangements that would follow. Everything was moving quickly. The deal was now public internally, and soon the outside world would know. My attorney also brought up the money that had been transferred to Ethan. Do you want us to pursue recovery? He asked. I thought about it. I want the money returned. All of it? Yes. And if Vanessa refuses? I looked at him. Then we'll handle it legally. I didn't want revenge, but I couldn't simply ignore what had happened. Trust was already damaged. Financial secrecy had made it worse. When I returned home, Vanessa was sitting in the living room. She looked exhausted. I spoke to Ethan, she said. I stopped. And, it's over. I nodded. The money? I'm going to get it back. How? I'll sell some investments and use my savings. I looked at her. You don't have to destroy yourself. She stared at me. I know. But I need to take responsibility. That sentence made me pause. For the first time, she wasn't asking me to solve her problem. She was accepting responsibility for it herself. Over the next several weeks, our house became strangely quiet. We continued living together, but we were no longer pretending everything was normal. Vanessa moved some of her things into the guest room. I spent most evenings in my office. We spoke when necessary, but we no longer argued. The anger had been replaced by something heavier, uncertainty. We both knew that our marriage had reached a point where simply saying, I'm sorry, wasn't enough. Then the news of the $700 million deal broke publicly. Within hours, my face appeared on business websites and television programs. Headlines described the acquisition as one of the biggest deals in the industry that year. My company became the subject of interviews, analysis, and speculation. People who had never heard of me before suddenly knew my name. Reporters started contacting Vanessa too. One afternoon, she came into my office holding her phone. They're asking me for interviews. I looked up. Don't do them. Why? Because this isn't about you. She looked at me. They want to know what it's like being married to the man behind the deal. I shook my head. You don't owe them a story. She smiled sadly. You still protect me. I looked at her. That's not what I'm doing. Yes, it is. I didn't respond. A few days later, Vanessa did something unexpected. She contacted everyone who had been at the dinner and apologized. She didn't tell them about the $700 million deal. She didn't try to make herself look better. She simply admitted that she had humiliated her husband and that what she had done was wrong. Melissa called me afterward. I owe you an apology too, she said. You don't. I should have stopped her. I appreciated the gesture, but I told her the truth. The problem wasn't the dinner. The problem was what happened long before it. She understood. Months passed. The acquisition process continued, and my company grew faster than I had ever imagined. My schedule became even more demanding, but this time I learned to create boundaries. I stopped working until midnight. I started taking weekends off. I returned to old hobbies. I met friends again. I traveled occasionally without feeling guilty. For the first time, I was successful without allowing success to consume me. Vanessa was changing too. She started therapy. She began spending time with her family. She stopped comparing herself to other people. She even started volunteering with a financial literacy organization for women who were struggling with insecurity and money management. When I asked why, she said, "I need to understand why I became that person." One evening, she came into my office carrying an old photograph. It was the same photograph I had once held alone. She placed it on my desk. "I found this in the storage room." I looked at it. We were standing outside our first apartment, both of us smiling. "I remember that day," she said. "So do I. You had only $40 left in your bank account." I smiled faintly. "You remember that?" "I remember everything." She sat down across from me. "I was happy." "You were." "We were happy." I nodded. Then she said, "I want that woman back." I looked at her. "You can't go backward." She nodded. "I know. You can become someone different." "I want to." I studied her face. "Why?" She took a deep breath. "Because I finally understand that I didn't lose my marriage because you weren't successful enough. I almost lost it because I stopped respecting the man I married." I didn't know what to say. She continued, "I thought money would make me feel safe. But when you actually got it, I realized how stupid that was." I looked at her. "Money can't make you feel loved." "I know. And it can't make someone respect you." "I know. It only makes it easier to see what was already there." She nodded. For several minutes, we sat quietly. Then she asked, "Do you still love me?" I looked at her. The answer was difficult because it was both simple and complicated. "Yes." She began crying. "But I don't trust you." She nodded. "I understand. And I don't know if that trust can come back." "I understand that too." She stood up. Before leaving, she turned around. "I don't want your money." I looked at her. "I don't want the house. I don't want the cars. I don't want anything you earned." She paused. "I just want the chance to prove that I can love you without measuring your worth." Then she walked out. I sat alone for several minutes. For the first time, I realized that maybe our marriage wasn't ending. Maybe it was finally being rebuilt on something more important than money. But rebuilding would take time. And I wasn't ready to forgive everything yet. Because the $700 million deal had changed my financial future. But the dinner had changed something much deeper. It had forced me to ask a question I should have asked years earlier. If the money disappeared tomorrow, would the person beside me still respect the man I am? I already knew what Vanessa's answer had once been. Now I had to discover whether she could give me a different one. "Don't do them." "Why?" "Because this isn't about you." She looked at me. "They want to know what it's like being married to the man behind the deal." I shook my head. "You don't owe them a story." She smiled sadly. "You still protect me." I looked at her. "That's not what I'm doing." "Yes, it is." I didn't respond. A few days later, Vanessa did something unexpected. She contacted everyone who had been at the dinner and apologized. She didn't tell them about the $700 million deal. She didn't try to make herself look better. She simply admitted that she had humiliated her husband and that what she had done was wrong. Melissa called me afterward. "I owe you an apology too," she said. "You don't." I should have stopped her. I appreciated the gesture, but I told her the truth. The problem wasn't the dinner. The problem was what happened long before it. She understood. Months passed. The acquisition process continued, and my company grew faster than I had ever imagined. My schedule became even more demanding, but this time I learned to create boundaries. I stopped working until midnight. I started taking weekends off. I returned to old hobbies. I met friends again. I traveled occasionally without feeling guilty. For the first time, I was successful without allowing success to consume me. Vanessa was changing too. She started therapy. She began spending time with her family. She stopped comparing herself to other people. She even started volunteering with a financial literacy organization for women who were struggling with insecurity and money management. When I asked why, she said, "I need to understand why I became that person." One evening, she came into my office carrying an old photograph. It was the same photograph I had once held alone. She placed it on my desk. I found this in the storage room. I looked at it. We were standing outside our first apartment, both of us smiling. I remember that day, she said. So do I. You had only $40 left in your bank account. I smiled faintly. You remember that? I remember everything. She sat down across from me. I was happy. You were. We were happy. I nodded. Then she said, I want that woman back. I looked at her. You can't go backward. She nodded. I know. You can become someone different. I want to. I studied her face. Why? She took a deep breath. Because I finally understand that I didn't lose my marriage because you weren't successful enough. I almost lost it because I stopped respecting the man I married. I didn't know what to say. She continued. I thought money would make me feel safe. But when you actually got it, I realized how stupid that was. I looked at her. Money can't make you feel loved. I know. And it can't make someone respect you. I know. It only makes it easier to see what was already there. She nodded. For several minutes, we sat quietly. Then she asked, Do you still love me? I looked at her. The answer was difficult because it was both simple and complicated. Yes. She began crying. But I don't trust you. She nodded. I understand. And I don't know if that trust can come back. I understand that too. She stood up. Before leaving, she turned around. I don't want your money. I looked at her. I don't want the house. I don't want the cars. I don't want anything you earned. She paused. I just want the chance to prove that I can love you without measuring your worth. Then she walked out. I sat alone for several minutes. For the first time, I realized that maybe our marriage wasn't ending. Maybe it was finally being rebuilt on something more important than money. But rebuilding would take time. And I wasn't ready to forgive everything yet. Because the $700 million deal had changed my financial future. But the dinner had changed something much deeper. It had forced me to ask a question I should have asked years earlier. If the money disappeared tomorrow, would the person beside me still respect the man I am? I already knew what Vanessa's answer had once been. Now I had to discover whether she could give me a different one.